So hi everyone, thank you for joining us today for the CWS Wildlife Chronicles webinar. My name is Simran Prasad and I am a doctoral fellow at the Center for Wildlife Studies. The Center for Wildlife Studies is a 37-year-old nonprofit organization with a focus in conservation research, education, and policy. We used to invite speakers to our office in Bangalore for the latest topics in wildlife research, conservation, and policy, but because of the COVID situation, it has given us the opportunity to stage this online, thereby taking it globally. We launched CWS Wildlife Chronicles, and this will be our 26th webinar. Our past webinars have included discussions on a range of topics, such as zoonotic diseases, species conservation relating to elephants and tigers, to name a few, and research on bioacoustics. If you would like to see our past webinars, you can visit our YouTube channel to view these. Today's webinar will also be recorded and available on our YouTube channel. If you wish to support CWS initiatives and other similar outreach work that we do, you can use this QR code to donate. You can also visit our website at cwsindia.org or get in touch with us. You can also write to us at outreach@cwsindia.org. Let's delve into the topic of discussion for today's webinar. The illegal wildlife trade is a serious threat to biodiversity globally. Wildlife crime through poaching and selling of illegally traded wildlife products continues to occur. I'm sure we are all intrigued to understand how illegal trade and markets function, and I'm excited to moderate what I'm sure will be an insightful discussion today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists. Mr. Damien Mander is founder of the International Anti-Poaching Foundation. Previously, Mr. Mander served as Special Operations Sniper and Clearance Diver for Australia. The International Anti-Poaching Foundation focuses on ranger training, operations, and integrating modern technology into conservation across Africa. Mr. Mander's work is community-oriented in tackling anti-poaching efforts and introducing local African women into the workforce through the use of wildlife ranger training through the Akashenga program. Welcome, Mr. Mander.
Hello, and thank you very much for having me. Thanks, Simran.
I'd like to introduce you all to our next panelist, Mr. Michael Saarolfs, who is a conservation economist and research associate at the University of Oxford. Mr. Saarolfs' research primarily focuses on wildlife trade dynamics, the complexities within legal and illegal markets for wildlife products, and the application of appropriate policies toward trade in endangered species. Welcome, Mr. Saarolfs.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and good evening, everybody.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce our third panelist, Ms. Tessa Ullman, who is a lead researcher at the Sanga Pangolin Project in the Zanga Sanga Forest Reserve of the Central African Republic. Ms. Ullman conducts ecological and social science research and manages a community monitoring initiative. Her research focuses on the local pangolin scale trade, understanding local perceptions, and mapping community forest areas to better serve the local and indigenous communities and the 3 pangolin species they coexist with. Welcome, Ms. Ullman.
Thanks for the introduction, and hi to everyone who's joined.
To complete our distinguished panel, we are delighted to have Ms. Yifu Wang join us. Ms. Wang is a researcher at the University of Hong Kong. Ms. Wang's research currently looks at the conflict between people and wild boars in Hong Kong and how people perceive the nuisances they cause. Ms. Wang's PhD focused on pangolin trade markets in China and how to conserve this group of highly trafficked mammals. A very warm welcome, Ms. Wang.
Thank you for having me.
So CWS welcomes all our esteemed panelists, and the first question, which I think comes to mind, is what is the trajectory of illegal trade? So based on your research and experience and the species and landscapes that you're familiar with, could you explain this to us? I'd like to open this question up to all of our panelists. So Ms. Wang, could you share your thoughts on this?
I think this is a quite difficult question for me because probably we all know that for pangolin trade, it involves so many countries and covers such a wide geographic range. I really couldn't really say what's the general trajectory of pangolin trade on a global scale. And even just for China, I think we just don't have enough evidence to have a very definite conclusion on the trajectory, and especially with COVID, which has caused a lot of change during the past few years, and in future, how would that happen, or how the trade would be influenced? Yeah, I think it's just very hard to predict.
Yeah, absolutely. Great, thank you, Ms. Wang. Mr. Manda, could you tell us your thoughts on this?
Yeah, definitely in relation to Zimbabwe, where the majority of our operations take place. Since 2018, our teams have made over 800 arrests, 295 of those have been ivory related. We've definitely seen a large upturn in the last sort of 12 to 24 months with ivory related arrests. But interestingly, we haven't seen an upturn in elephant poaching. So the ivory that we're seeing is actually coming out of stockpiles, and it's people looking for additional ways to make money in what is globally a very economically challenging time. We're also seeing an upturn in bushmeat poaching. So these are social issues. And quite often as conservationists, we're drawing from some of the smallest pools of funding, but we're also asked to deal with some of the biggest social issues. So it is a very challenging environment at the moment. And also given that so much of conservation funding is relying on tourism, the lack of that income into the continent at the moment is it's providing us all with a whole lot of extra work. I'm positive about where we're going, and hopefully, having spent the last couple of months being able to travel around the US and Europe, starting to see the world open up a bit. So hopefully that tourism starts reflecting in Africa, and we see some more money coming to our industry.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you, Mr. Manda. Ms. Ullman, what are your views on this?
I share them with both the people who just spoke. I mean, IFU, of course, we're in the same research field. So studying pangolins in the Central African Republic, we are at the source of the activity. So, there is a local pangolin scale trade, and the local communities and indigenous peoples here do consume protein, pangolin meat, but it's a comparatively small market to neighboring Cameroon and Republic of Congo. But I guess the point is that any presence of a market is a threat to local populations of that species, because it can only grow. So in terms of trajectory on a very local level where we are, I think that we're going to see an increase in the demand for pangolin scales. But in a general sense about, if it's possible to answer it, which I don't think it is, but in global wildlife trade markets, it's not going anywhere. I think it'll fluctuate as most legal and illegal markets do. But I have to share also my positive and optimistic outlook on the work that's being done specifically in the wildlife trade.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ms. Ullman. Mr. Sarols, could you share your experience with us?
Sure, thank you. So I'm going to give a slightly different answer. It's going to be more of a big picture answer, and maybe a bit more pessimistic. The way I see it, I think wildlife trafficking, illegal trade is on a growth trajectory, and it's going to continue that way. And I say that for three reasons. There are three main factors driving this. Two of them are just related to human population growth, and particularly in the developing countries where a lot of biodiversity occurs, for example, in Africa. It's just simple numbers. It's people encroaching into wild areas, coming into more contact with wildlife. At the same time, we're seeing economic growth. So more people wanting more food, more traditional medicines, all the types of things that people consume. And as their incomes grow, the demand and the prices they're willing to pay for these products will also increase. And then the third factor is we are criminalizing trade more and more. More and more species are getting listed on CITES, more regulations are passed. And it's a simple fact that if you criminalize more activity, you will get more crime. So I'm afraid those three factors together draw to sort of paint a picture of increasing wildlife exploitation and what we define as wildlife crime.
Right, definitely. Thank you, Mr. Sarolfs, and thank you all. Staying with you, actually, Mr. Sarolfs, what components do you think segregate different illegal wildlife markets across the world? How do they differ, and how do you think demand varies across the globe?
Okay, well, I think it's really complicated, but I think a good way to think about this is always to start off with domestic markets, because a lot of illegal consumption, poaching, trade takes place at domestic levels, and then it only tends to filter through to international markets if international buyers are willing to pay much higher prices for the products concerned, whether it's meat, and if you think about products like ivory and rhino horn, pangolin scales that are in demand in East Asia. And that's also driven a lot by affluence. So whereas in let's say the previous century or in the century before, a lot of that demand came from the West, from Europe and North America, because those were the more prosperous economies, there's now been a shift to East Asia, for example, where there's still these continuing cultures of using, let's say, traditional medicines, and then looking further afield to meet those demands. So there's these sort of broad geopolitical patterns, but always look to where the wealthy and developing countries are, because that's where a lot of the demand is going to be driven from. But also watch places like Africa as they grow and develop, because I think we will see more demand emerging there as well. So it all has to do with shifting economies, shifting cultural tastes. Yeah. If that answers your question.
Yes, it definitely does. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sarolfs. Ms. Alman, what tools do you believe we should use to better understand the complexities of the illegal wildlife trade? Sorry, Ms. Alman,
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah, also complicated to answer that one, but I think first it's important to just mention, to stress that, illegal wildlife trade, these markets are not monolithic, and that in order to reflect the diversity of the actors and the products and the markets, the tools and the approaches that we use to understand them all have to be equally diverse. And to do that, to understand illegal wildlife trade markets generally, I mean, we have to move away from the oversimplification of even our language on how we talk about this. And so that's moving beyond caricatures like the poachers and the super Asian consumers, and really understanding that there is a diverse typologies of actors and products that are in trade, and so, there are a number of frameworks that we can use that have been developed for understanding. I'm going to say IWT because that's a shorter way of, and saves time. But I guess the first step in any attempt to understand is to contextualize the trade. So that means applying parameters such as even just studying the biology of the species to understanding the level of successful governance in the range, transit, or the source country, to even measuring the social or relational value of the product that's in question. And after you've done that, after you've contextualized the trade, I mean, it's important to also define the products, characterize the actors, as I've already mentioned, but to develop typology so that you really understand the whole range of people that are involved, the stakeholders, and of course, understanding the networks. So are we talking about subsistence and local use, or are we talking about online trade? So really, those are broad categories to cover, but once you've done that, once you've contextualized things, then you can start to attempt to design and develop interventions that are going to be not only effective and appropriate, but fair and just.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ms. Alman.
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Wang, As you know, social media can play an important role when it comes to the illegal wildlife trade. How does social media platforms influence illegal wildlife trade dynamics across the world? Can demand for products fluctuate based on digital markets?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think we probably all agree that social media has influenced our lifestyle greatly. We probably all use social media in one way or another. And so similarly, it of course influences wildlife trade, whether it's legal or illegal. And I think probably most profoundly from three aspects. Firstly is that it really facilitates trade as either an advertisement platform or as a trading platform. So that shifting from the traditional way of a physical store where people can only walk into a shop to see what the owners have, versus here that you have this vast information and spread easily across the world very efficiently. And secondly is that it can really sort of create demand that really wasn't there before, or amplify a demand that probably originally only localized or regionalized. And in that case, I think exotic pet trade is a perfect example, where in the past, we probably would hardly know that there is, very cute loris out there that 1,000 miles away from us. But now you see a video on Facebook and that makes you think, okay, I might want to have one. So, but of course, with that, we also had to see the positive side of social media. As conservationists, we probably use it to, spread the correct information as well in terms of raising awareness or changing people's behavior, etc. And also, as a researcher, I often see social media as a very rich data source as well, which can help us to understand trade from a different angle. Yeah,
definitely. Thank you, Ms. Wang. Mr. Manda, from your experience working with the incredible women in Akashinga, the all-female anti-poaching group, how do you unravel the complexities of illegal wildlife markets at a regional level?
Yeah, so and not to try and speak above our my pay grade, our work is, as you say, regional level and landscape level. So our evolution as an organization, we started off in 2009. We're a service provider going out to train rangers, provide security services to other organizations and to governments. In 2017, we stopped being a service provider with a primary focus on elephants and rhinos, because that's where our sort of skill set lay. And we have a fairly heavily law enforcement focused approach to how we went about it. We stopped being a service provider, and we actually started partnering with local Indigenous communities to buy long-term leases ranging from 20 to 45 years on areas held under what's called traditional or tribal land trust areas, which collectively across Africa make up more than twice as much land that's set aside for national parks. Traditionally, the economic model for many of these areas has been trophy hunting, and as trophy hunting has failed, these areas stand to be lost to agriculture or human settlement. So we wanted to find a way to generate or to be able to put the same amount into the local communities as what trophy hunting did, and in doing so motivate conservation from the local communities. We started taking a look at not only long-term land partnerships, but as biodiversity as a whole, recognizing that when these areas are protected, that all the animals are being looked after, and the elephants and rhinos included. And then we stopped looking at parks in isolation or reserves in isolation, and we started looking at how these parks fit together across wide landscapes within a single political boundary. We found that the greatest potential for success and measurable results on the ground was working within a single political boundary and not trying to work across transfrontier areas, as even though they are a great vision to have. We wanted to be able to have the maximum impact with the resources we had. We started in 2017 on this particular project with 16 women protecting 90,000 acres. We've now scaled, we have 8 reserves, we have 1.3 million acres under contract, and 240 staff that are part of this program, and almost 4 million more acres that have been negotiated in 2 other countries at the moment that were also previously reserved for trophy hunting. We centralized our strategy in conservation around women's empowerment. It gave us the greatest traction in community development and conservation essentially became a byproduct. So we're coming at this now, instead of a very law enforcement focused approach, looking from inside the park out, we're looking from the communities in. I suppose one of the key components of this model and deploying women, 95% of our security staff are women, is that women naturally de-escalate tension. So de-escalation means demilitarization. We cut our core operating costs by 2/3. The remaining 2/3 of the money that we had, we invested into these local communities, into healthcare, education, water sanitation, and infrastructure development. And all of these continue to build on that social approach. And it seems like every dollar we spend in the communities is a dollar or two less we have to spend on law enforcement within these areas. And it's given us the ability to be able to scale these programs and have a much greater level of biodiversity protection. We've seen wildlife populations increase by, mammal populations increase by almost 400% in the initial pilot areas. And we've seen a reduction across the mid to lower Zambezi and elephant poaching of around 80% over the last 4 years. So it's definitely something that's working. We're still continuously refining it. And it's a model, it's a tool that I think not only are we're happy to continue using, but other organizations are starting to adopt.
Thank you, Ms. Amanda. That's really incredible. And thank you for sharing with us about your work. Policy and conservation management can also play crucial roles when it comes to tackling illegal trade. Mr. Sarolfs, based on your experience, how do we evaluate the effectiveness of policies that tackle illegal trade?
Right, that's a tough one. So the ultimate test, of course, is whether the species are doing better in the wild. And that's a lot easier to determine at a very local scale, evaluating something like an anti-poaching project in a particular area. But as we zoom out, it gets harder and harder. And the further we get away from the ground, it also gets harder and harder. One problem we have is at a species level, there are very few species where we can actually monitor what's happening to their populations very well. With a lot of species, I mean, even African elephants are hard to count. So it's really difficult to monitor populations and then to relate what populations are doing to particular policy interventions. There are all sorts of proxy measures, for example, detecting poaching trends and rates, but that alone doesn't tell you that much, because if you, for example, with rhino poaching, you now have to spend 3 or 4 times as much to maintain the same rates, then obviously the pressure is much greater. Then other things that are done are, for example, monitoring seizure data over time. But that's also tricky because there are other variables that could affect that, like better enforcement or improvements in detection technology. And so you can't rely on that alone. And then the trickiest of all are market and consumer surveys. There's a lot of potential things that can go wrong in those kinds of surveys, because these are often illegal products. People don't necessarily tell the truth. People could tell the survey respondent what they want to hear. So one has to be very careful in how one evaluates policy measures at that end of the spectrum. So really, at the end of the day, the best measure is how well are the species doing.
Really interesting. Thank you, Mr. Sarolfs. Ms. Alman, drawing on your research and experience, when it comes to perception, how do we work on understanding people's perception of wildlife? And accordingly, what could be driving demand for products?
Motivates people to participate.
Sorry, Ms. Alman.
Oh, am I on mute again?
No. Yes.
No. Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just start from the beginning. Sorry. I was just saying that understanding what motivates people to participate in any illegal wildlife trade, and that's from whether it's harvesting, selling, or consuming, is tremendously important. And there's a very rich body of research that applies, social science methods to these kinds of topics, to better understand things such as motivation, preference, perceptions of the actors involved. And I'll use the example of wild meat consumption. So we understand that the hunting for consumption of wild meat is a major threat to biodiversity conservation and food security, in this example, in sub-Saharan Africa. But at the same time, we also know that wild meat is an important source of protein for rural and hunting communities. So clearly, if we're interested in developing alternatives, appropriate protein alternatives need to be chosen. But a lot of these interventions that do promote these alternatives to eating wild meat, and this includes farming livestock to farming fish, they often fail in their objectives. And it's because they're not rooted in understanding why people consume wild meat in the first place. And they often ignore the underlying drivers of why people choose to consume wild meat. And this is very relevant to where I work, which is in a rural community, in a reserve where pangolins have been traditionally consumed. And an example of a really successful interdisciplinary research project is the Why Eat Wild Meat project, which is a collaboration of different academic institutions. And this is what they're looking at. It's to, in combination with other things, conducting field work. And most recently, they were in the Jaw biosphere of Cameroon. And they revealed that drivers like accessibility to, relative cost, taste, and cultural influences were the main drivers of their choice in consuming wild meat. So taste is particularly relevant for me because across the board, whoever you ask who eats pangolin, they'd say it's delicious. So, taste is obviously an important, it's a powerful motivator. And this helps us understand that if we're designing alternatives, whoever is promoting alternatives in the first place, has to make sure in this case that they taste good. So it's just to drive home an anecdote that understanding perceptions, taste, preferences, these are all, central in the design of appropriate interventions that really reflect the local context.
Thank you, Ms. Elman. It's really interesting. Mr. Manda, based on your experience, what are the challenges when it comes to assessing policies that tackle illegal trade?
I think we're probably at the greatest example in the history of our civilization now, what not looking after nature looks like. A global community brought to its knees because of a COVID pandemic, which is a direct result of the way we treat nature. We degrading a system that's evolved over billions of years. And I think as a species, we are capable of great things when we push far enough into a corner. And I'm hoping that the tougher this situation becomes as a global community, the greater the response is going to be on a global scale on the other end. And a lot of that is going to do with policy and regulations and law enforcement. But the number one ingredient that we are looking for as a group of conservationists is political will. And quite often the conservation agenda sits so far down on, with politics. I'm really hoping that that the situation, we got millions of people that have died, billions of people in lockdown, and we're looking at trillions of dollars of international deficit. I'm really hoping that the realization that if we just invested a little bit more of that into protecting nature in the first place, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. So I'm optimistic, but yet to see a change is significant enough that I'm sure would make us all optimistic. But we sleep at night knowing that the situation would be much worse if we weren't all doing what we're doing. We have a job that will never be complete, and that's what makes it it's so important that we keep going, all doing what we're doing the best at it. With the knowledge that hopefully one day international governments are going to kick in and be able to supply the support that we need to do our jobs properly.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Manda. Ms. Wang, to understand demand and perception, how should we evaluate the effectiveness of approaches such as demand reduction campaigns?
Yeah, I'm actually very happy that we're talking about evaluation here, because I think it's a part that's greatly missing from a lot of the intervention that we are doing. I'm actually part of the study actually led by researchers from Oxford that looks at the environmental campaigns using celebrity endorsement and across like different languages and led by in different countries. And what we found is that most of the campaigns are actually doesn't even include the evaluation part, or in the designing stage, or they don't sort of report it at the end. And even if they do, sometimes their goal or what they claim to be the goal and what they are measuring as the indicators often mismatch. I think that echoes with what Michelle and also Tessa are talking about. It's very difficult actually to measure the effectiveness, but if we sort of really gave more careful thought, we can do a better job than not including any evaluation, which is what we are observing for many of the campaigns that has been launched. And so I think, of course, from the ideal, in the ideal world, we would like to use mechanisms such as randomized control trials, or in a more sort of strict comparison way to really tell whether that campaign is effective or not. But of course, the real world is much more complex and we can't control everything. And also what our ultimate goal is for the wild species to do better, but often on the ground, we're, for example, raising awareness, and there is often a lag between people's attitude and what they actually do. And we have to recognize all these caveats of what we can do on the ground and our ultimate goal, which I think is fine as long as we recognize that as a designing stage. So yeah, I think I kind of already answered the questions that evaluation is really a crucial part and has to be integrated into the designing and as a default.
Great, thank you, Ms. Wang. Actually, staying with you, Ms. Wang, how do we improve our efforts in engaging with conservation management and policy that can better conserve trafficked species?
That's a very broad question, actually, when I saw it. But I think as a researcher, maybe I can only speak from this positionality that I think we do need a lot more case study. With that, I'm not saying like global study or looking at the global trend is not helpful. That of course can give us a lot of interesting insights on understanding the trade. But I think from practical side, on the ground, case study can provide a lot more sort of suggestions or helpful information to actually how we can design feasible management and also effective policies. And in parallel with that, also echo with what everyone is talking about is local communities and including local voices. From my own research, because my pangolin research was done in China. And what I do see is that the local voices is often not represented enough or consulted enough, especially with, for example, traditional Chinese medicine communities. For pangolins, a lot of the campaigns focusing on the medical value or try to persuade people to not use pangolin scale as the medicine. But from the message that they're presenting to the public, I can clearly see that definitely the experts from the TCM or the traditional Chinese medicine community are not really involved or being consulted during the process. And that of course can cause a lot of problems. Firstly, the traditional Chinese medicine communities wouldn't really appreciate the way they're being framed or the wordings that are being used, etc. And thus the message kind of is a bit irritating to them as well. And I think that definitely wouldn't help in any way for pangolin conservation, because what we really should do is to include the local voice and also collaboration with the local community.
Great, thank you, Ms. Wang. Mr. Sarolfs, as serious threats to biodiversity and endangered species occur worldwide, what disciplines and concepts do you think are important to engage with when focusing on policies that can address the trade of endangered species?
Well, I think my answer follows quite nicely on from the previous two answers we heard. I really want to highlight the importance of the social sciences. So the biological sciences can help with monitoring species populations, and they can help with technological things, for example, like traceability. But essentially, this is a social problem. It's fundamentally a problem involving people. To really bring about change, we need to use the best social science and behavioral science tools we can. I'd highlight a role for interdisciplinary economists who understand markets, but also understand institutions, incentives, and regulatory theory to understand what the most sensible policy options might be. Criminologists obviously are very important in tackling the illegal side, and criminology is also completely interdisciplinary. So there would be links with law, politics, anthropology, sociology, psychology. All of these disciplines have a role to play and need to be integrated, which is not easy. Conceptually, I think there are three concepts I would like to highlight. The one is the whole concept of institutions and institutional theory. Institutions being the rules of the game, which could either be formal rules like laws, or they could be informal rules that come by way of customs. And leading on from that, there are concepts of institutional interplay and fit, which are really important, because when you have formal institutions, laws that are in conflict with social customs, they're not going to work as well. So you really need to look at carving out rules and regulations that align, at least to some extent, with the values of people on the ground and their cultures and traditions. They can be changed, but it can't be done forcibly. It needs to be done sensitively. Leading on from that, I think the final concept I really want to highlight is that there is such a thing as optimal regulation. In other words, not too much regulation, because over-regulation, I believe, is actually counterproductive. So one needs to find the optimal way to regulate, just how much and more sensitively and more specifically, rather than just say, try to ban everything and hope that everything is going to work out. Because if you overreach with a ban, people are just going to ignore it, and you're probably going to end up with the worst results.
All right, that's really insightful. Thank you, Mr. Sarolfs. Mr. Manda, how do we integrate more community-based solutions into conservation management and policy to better tackle poaching activity?
Yeah, I mean, just to lead on from what Michael has said there, this is a social issue. The UN Population Division projects there's going to be 2 billion people on the African continent by 2040, and unless we can increasingly find a way to tackle this from a social side, we're just going to be we can't defend these areas with bigger fences and more guns and hope to be able to maintain any form of wilderness at scale. I'll say one thing, just as an example, something that we saw within our own case study, and maybe it's not relevant globally, but just as an example of one of the benefits that we saw from centralizing our strategy around women, and that was the increasing militarization of conservation that we saw, in particular around what was termed the Rhino Wars. It sort of forced governments to make a decision between community work and conservation, and drove a wedge between the two. Now people vote and animals don't, so governments are often siding with communities, which push conservation further down the agenda. Now, with the women deployed and the de-escalation and demilitarization that has brought for us, we have seen governments actually taking a much more collective role in supporting the two. So women seem to have become the bridge that conservation had to build back into communities, at least in the areas that we've been working, and to the point where President Mnangagwa's daughter in Zimbabwe is one of our rangers now, and the president has been very vocal about supporting the project as not only a biodiversity conservation project, but as a social development project across the country.
Great, thank you, Mr. Manda. I think we have a time for one final question before I take questions from the audience. So I'd like to address this question to Ms. Allman. Ms. Allman, how do we involve stakeholders in decisions that can affect demand for illegal products?
Yeah, this is a really important and overlooked question. You know, when we talk about reducing demand for any wildlife product, it also means changing behavior, which is a supremely challenging task that can take, you know, decades at times. And Ifu, I'm sure, is better versed in this topic than I am, but I can say that essentially, you know, wide and comprehensive stakeholder engagement involvement is a critical component of any effective consumer demand reduction intervention. And but I think more importantly, before understanding how to involve them, what seems to be lacking, and I just took a facilitator's course on this recently, is really identifying all of the stakeholders. So who are going to be the people who are involved in this and who are going to either bear the costs or be responsible in the implementation of these policies or interventions. And that can be pretty tricky because there's a wide range of stakeholders and a lot of them have differing interests. So we think about, you know, government representatives, NGOs, the consumer groups themselves, local community indigenous leaders who are often not given a space at these important discussions. That could be the industry leaders. I mean, if we think about the fur trade, I mean, the labels themselves who are selling these products need to be involved in discussions if we're talking about reducing the demand for fur in the fashion industry. Media influencers, traditional medicine practitioners. So there's representation from all those groups into one room to talk about an issue. It's massively challenging. So I guess the one simple mechanism is meetings and workshops. So making sure that has constant communication and, you know, offering real buy-in and encouraging knowledge sharing is so it's a real commitment, because as I said before, you know, these campaigns in most cases, and the will to stay involved and stay committed can really so it's a really big challenge and we don't talk about it enough.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Alman, and thank you all. It has been a really engaging discussion. We will now take questions from the audience, and they've just sent them in to us. So one question, which I think is a really interesting one, is as a new PhD student motivated to support the intervention of wildlife trade and bushmeat through research, what research areas currently lack the most data and effort that would be most helpful? So Mr. Michael Sarofs, would you like to go first?
I'm not sure I can answer that. I don't really work much on wild meat myself. But I would say any research that engages with consumers is a really important place to start. I know there is a lot of this work ongoing already, but I would say there's definitely scope for more. Because I think consumer engagement, understanding what factors will enable consumer behavior change and what won't, is really important. And what is often lacking is sensitive kind of research that really engages with the culture of the people that are involved. So ideally, you need local people who understand the local culture to at least be partners in that type of research.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Sarofs. Mr. Manda, would you like to share your thoughts with us?
Yeah, just briefly, you know, not only understanding the current climate in terms of the demand of existing food systems, but the changes in those food systems and the willingness to adopt those, particularly in a place like Africa, where, I mean, you see, you know, predominantly an increasing amount of plant-based diets being adopted around the world. And the potential for, say, continents like Africa to be able to access some of these alternatives going forward and how that's going to play a role in us reducing the pressure on things such as bushmeat poaching. So that for me is interesting. I think, we're at a very not only critical but exciting time in history where we're looking at not only plant-based alternatives but lab-grown meats that can be produced on scale at cost using a fraction of the area, a fraction of the water, no hormones, no antibiotics, and when we reach a tipping point where that becomes scalable and cheaper than current food systems, I think the potential of that changing the world as we know it, not just in a poaching or conservation context, is very exciting, and it's something that I think I'll be able to witness in my lifetime.
Definitely. Thank you, Mr. Manda. Ms. Alman, could you share your thoughts with us?
I encourage you to visit this. I referenced this project before, Meats interdisciplinary project, and it's an incredible source that I think will be pretty valuable if you're looking at paucity in the literature and areas for future research. But yeah. And what has been said now, Michael, as well. The consumption behaviors, the motivations for participating, and to move. But that's about, I'm talking about specifically to where I work, access to forms of protein, the cost. These are really important any regional policies. So yeah, that's what I'll say.
Great, thank you, Ms. Alman. Ms. Wang, could you share your thoughts with us?
Yeah, and I think I kind of mentioned it a little bit already that I think localized case study is really the key to go, where rather than, going to like aiming for large scale, but like choose an area and study in depth in every way that you can, either social science or ecology or criminology, economics, but like really on the ground. I think that's a way that can provide most useful information for like on the practice side.
Great, thank you, Ms. Wang. We also have another question. So it says, how confident do our panelists feel about the field of wildlife forensics in investigation of wildlife crimes and illegal wildlife trade? So Mr. Manda, would you like to go first?
Yeah, look, a lot of it does come down to the local level, and this is a battle that's been fought on multiple levels, from demand reduction, transnational crime, policy, the social issues, the on the ground biodiversity protection. But I mean, for us, we put a very strong focus into the forensics and the protection of crime scene and working with the local authorities. Last year, we had an 87.5% conviction rate of the arrests that we'd made. This year, we're sitting at around 82.5%, but also bearing in mind a lot of those cases are still outstanding. So basically, you put all this work into trying to stop someone from poaching or catch someone who's committing a crime. The other side, what we call the right of bang, is as important. Otherwise, people are just going to be going back out there and repeating the same crime over and over again. So forensics, ballistics, all of that plays a huge role in the success chain of being able to reduce wildlife crime.
Great, thank you, Mr. Manda. Mr. Michael Sarovs, could you share your thoughts with us?
Yeah, just two quick comments that I think forensics are very important. there are two constraining factors, though. They're not a panacea, obviously. And the two constraining factors are funding. Often there's really good technology out there, but there isn't always the funding to employ it. And then, of course, you can have very good forensics, but you also need a functioning law enforcement system, a corruption-free enforcement system. And so you can have all these good technologies, but if you don't have a fully functional enforcement system that is corruption-free, again, it's not necessarily going to solve the problem. So it's a tool in the toolbox.
Great, thank you, Mr. Sarolfs. Ms. Alman, would you mind sharing your thoughts with us?
Really covered it. It's a and developing a database, concentrate on those locations for enforcement operations, but it's all quite challenging. It's ideally what would happen, but of course, as Michael pointed out, we have to look at governance and presence of corruption if these are enabling or disabling factors.
Great, thank you, Ms. Altman. Ms. Wang, could you share your thoughts with us?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in forensics, but from my limited knowledge, I do see it as a very powerful tool. And I also think that because forensics has been used widely in criminology or field beyond like wildlife crime, so I think we should look what has been used in other fields and then see how could it be adapted for wildlife management as well.
Great, thank you, Ms. Wang. We've also received another question. In what ways can you imagine spatial technologies being used to support the effort, for example, GIS mapping or remote sensing? So Mr. Sarolfs, would you like to go first?
I think I'm going to answer this question much in the same way as the previous question. I think it's all useful technology, and we need to employ all the technology we can. But again, it's subject to the same constraints that we need to have functioning law enforcement. We need to win the hearts and minds of people, and that the technology is just a tool.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Sarolfs. Mr. Manda, would you share your thoughts with us?
Yeah, I think those words, their hearts and minds, are probably the most important ingredient that we can have, in on-the-ground implementation. We're often trying to replace Africa's most valuable asset. It's people with algorithms, and the way I look at it is if you get the social side right, you've sort of, that's the first 90% of it, and it's actually some of the most cost-effective ways to implement a workable solution on the ground. Once you have the social side right, then you can start introducing some of the technology that people are looking at. But there's no point having a drone that's going to find something 50 kilometers away if you don't have a ground team that can respond, a road network to get there, or people that know what to do once they're on a scene that effectively poachers have probably left 2 or 3 hours ago. So I would say, when you're focusing on getting the first 90% right with working with people and just really getting back to basics and working on the basics, making sure that your communities are motivated, making sure that your teams have the right basic training, the right basic equipment, that they believe their job is the most important job in the world. If you get that right, you don't need to go and spend millions and millions of dollars on fancy technology. Some of that technology can be an add-on. For example, we use GeoSuite as a way to paint a geospatial picture, real-time command and control of what we do in our operations. But the human intelligence side of what we do is probably also one of the most powerful tools of what we had. Human intelligence is driven by communities that are willing to give information because they're happy with what we're doing, and they want to work with us rather than against us. So that's my perception on technology within conservation. I'm not excluding it. I'm just saying let's get back to basics and get the basics right, and work on the hearts and minds from the social side.
Thank you, Mr. Manda. Ms. Alman, what are your views on this?
Yeah, absolutely agreement with Damien. And a project that we are currently working on is actually trying to use geospatial software, mapping software, to get each of the village communities that lives within this reserve to map the sectors of their forest. And this is the next phase of this community monitoring project that we have. And what we've seen is an incredible enthusiasm for adopting and being taught any form of technology, with GPS devices. We map these sectors together. It's a visible, tangible result of their participation. So it can also, on the other side of things, it can win hearts and minds to introduce technology that they use, that is a tool in how they can communicate their knowledge systems. And so, yeah, it's a really promising phase of the project, and yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Alman. Sounds really exciting with the project as well. Ms. Wang, what are your views on this?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't really use spatial technology or GIS in relation to wildlife trade. I see it more like to study ecology or environment rather than the crime or the trade itself. But so echo with everyone else, I think really social is the true way to go. And but I think another advantage for spatial technology is probably it's very strong in terms of visualization. Right, so that it's a sort of easier way to engage, for example, public, or attracting point rather than a dry paragraph that's describing where the trade is going, etc. So I think from that aspect, it can also help.
Great, thank you, Ms. Wang. We also have a question for Ms. Alman, specifically, why are pangolins amongst the most traded species? Is the demand local or international?
What a question. Where to begin? And Ifo, I'm sure will be happy to help answer this question in part as well. Well, to understand the why, you have to understand, pangolins and their derivatives, right? So it's not just the animal that is being consumed, but it's its parts. And so we have two different markets that are taking place. We have the market for the meat and the market for the scales that have multiple uses. And what's important is that there is local consumption in both of these markets. So while a lot of the volume of trafficking is transnational and intercontinental, there is an important domestic local use of these products as well. So an important example of pangolin scale use is in traditional medicines, and that includes traditional Chinese medicine. So that's where the largest market exists, according to the seizure data and the trade data. But we also have local consumption of the meat among rural communities, urban communities. Pangolin meat, as I've mentioned before, apparently is delicious. So we have a source of protein, but also one that's highly desirable. It's also eaten as a luxury dish in some Southeast Asian communities. So yeah, it's important to not just see this as the source being Africa and the destination being Asia, but we have pangolins that have been traditionally consumed locally in the range states where they occur. Ifo, I'm sure you have something to add on to that.
Yes, Ms. Wang.
Yeah, I mean, I only look at trade within China, so not really on the international side. But from my personal point of view, I don't really like to sort of identify the major or the main driver for the market, because I think we don't really have evidence to say which, whether it's medicine or the meat is the driving forces, although they're both huge from the seizure data we can tell. And yeah, so with that, I think because given the endangered status of almost all the population in the world, any sort of large demand needs to be tackled and reduced.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Wang. Thank you all. As we're running out of time, we will have to conclude our webinar today. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all our panelists for taking the time out and participating in an exciting discussion today. I hope all of you in the audience enjoyed our CWS Wildlife Chronicles webinar. To know more about us or get involved in our organization, you can write to us at outreach@cwsindia.org. Thank you once again, and we'll see you in our next CWS Wildlife Chronicles webinar.
Thanks, Imran. And thanks everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.